these mics. You really have to put them all the way up to your mouth.
Okay, I'll see how you do. And,
Okay. Yeah, I'll be like chomping on it.
Okay.
Good crowd stayed for talkback. Good question. Good afternoon, everyone. We are so glad that you have stayed with us for Talkback, whether you're joining us here in person or online for Talkback. We're so glad that you're here for Talkback with Reverend Dr. Bill Leonard and his sermon, Bystander, ? Let's give Bill another hand for this amazing sermon today. Bill, we have a number of questions here, but before we get started, let me first just say thank you for a challenging message, a right-on-time message, as they would say. Talk us through the preparation for this sermon for you. You said it began as early as March, and that you've done 5 drafts. Why did it take you 5 drafts? And
in part because I always have multiple drafts, number one, and that's what I love about computers. I often put all the things I'm thinking about on one draft and then save it and edit throughout. And so so I have multiple drafts. I usually don't have this many, but the times kept changing. And the way I was thinking about this and about these issues, the phrase Christian nationalism has been around for a long time, and I was a little hesitant to address it because everybody may be bored with it because we hear it all the time. But the Baptist Joint Committee has been my guide and teacher. They rose to this occasion in many ways earlier than most of us, to see it coming and sense it. And I've been with them some on some shared programs, and so that it stays in my head. And then you keep running into the issue of Christian nationalism, and that made me think of different ways I wanted to look at it, and that was another reason for the draft. And with this text, I'm sure you could tell I really brought this text because that verse, and they laid their coats at the feet of Saul, is just poignant beyond measure. It just says everything, and it introduces us to him, and then he has this long history. You know, in the Corinthian text, he says, "I went breathing out threats." And so he really becomes a representative of a person who was a bystander and then stepped into a movement and then stepped out of it, which is a sign of grace and redemption somehow. And we all go around and around with Paul. And so I'll just say this real quickly. I always have to keep thinking. Paul accepted slavery as a social given. We don't. And that's where, in my view, the gospel carried us much farther than it carried him. And terribly enough, his text then, with all this biblical inerrancy stuff, gave false but very poignant privilege to slave holders for a long, long time, and to some extent still. So we always need to say that. That's why in Christ there's neither Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. I think you have to say that becomes a developing gift of grace as years change, and we're not anywhere near that blanket statement right now. So I just kept going back, and you also don't, and this is why Parsons was so helpful to me. You don't want to make this the Jews are beating up on the Christians thing. Right. And for him to say, and that's something I don't think I'd thought about quite as closely as he made me. that these are all Jewish folks. And you've got the ethnocentrism of a much larger group of diaspora Jews from one global struggle to then the one that's coming in 70 CE. Right. And so being able to say this is internal and we're internal. Right. And then because I just think we're, like it or not, the Christian nationalist folks have dragged all the rest of us into this. And we can't sit by. There you go.
That's a perfect setup, Bill, for this next question. And this is an actual question from one of our congregants. Trump recently said, "I'm a Christian, and I'm calling all Christians to vote for me." Clearly, we are in an inter-religious dispute between Christians right now. Do we let that kind of thing go as people of faith, or do we have some, this is the question says, or call to a broader vision of Christianity that needs to be recognized in the midst of one political candidate saying, "I am the Christian candidate, vote for me as the Christian candidate"?
I try not to use the T word in public. And that's another reason for, I kept wanting to, that was in some of the drafts, I'll confess. But the question is well phrased because when any political candidate talks like that and stakes out that territory, we can't be bystanders. I think that was at the same place where he said, if all of you Christians will vote for me this time, you won't have to vote no more. Go back and check. And that tightens up all our muscles. It's where this is going. And so we'll say straight up here that underneath the quote Christian nationalism is a very strong effort to make one kind of Christianity normative in a Christian nation. And this is the road to establishmentarianism. And I've read enough of the Baptists to know I can't go near that. And not betray them and betray the witness and the action and the insights. How, I think I may have said this last summer because it may have come up, but how was it that 17th century people, 400 years ago, with no, and this is even pre-Enlightenment, right. It's that early in the 1600s. How was it they saw that? Because they said, faith cannot be coerced. And they were living in countries that were coercing faith. And where to be born into a particular European state was to have required baptism into the Christian church. It's why Roger Williams wrote a treatise called Christening No Christians Make. And what he meant was not infant baptism, he meant citizenship through baptism. And that comment, the other thing that I just have to say out loud is I do not understand how so many people who claim the name Baptist are violating their history at every turn. I do not understand that. Yeah. And I understand this whole name thing. I understand that. But whatever we call ourselves, we can't relinquish that heritage because it was the start of modern pluralism. Because they didn't just say that the people who believe the wrong Christian things have to be silenced. They said the people who don't believe have to be dealt with. And the earliest Baptists said, God alone is judge of conscience, and neither the state nor a state-privileged church can judge the conscience of the heretic, the folks who don't believe nothing, the folks who don't believe the right stuff, or the atheist, the people who don't believe at all. And that was, it was proto-pluralism. It was anticipating what we're still, and 400 years later, that's still on the altar. And that's why we have to respond. And even if we're a minority, and I just don't understand how people can take that name and carry it into that kind of autocracy.
So this is a church made up of atheists and heretics, who has really strived over 80 years, as you know, Bill, better than anybody, not to be bystanders. And we face this moment, and I think there are many people sitting in this sanctuary who have already made a commitment that they're not going to be bystanders in this coming age, in this moment. But I thought it was more intriguing to me that you talked about how institutions can be bystanders, and that book that you cited about how the church in Germany became a bystander. And so just as individuals are called to a particular moment like this, called to particular tasks at particular times, so are also institutions and churches. You referenced the name discussion that we're having, but we have much broader questions ahead of us besides the name. What do you think it means for a church in this moment to not be a bystander in this era? What does that look like?
It's the heart of the word we've often used in our various traditions. It's the heart of witness. It is witness in the absolute most, I think, biblical sense of the term. It is saying, and it is, and we've talked about it here before, it is the nature of dissent. And so the nature of the witness is such that institutions are always going to be responding with authoritarian ways, if possible, and control. And consistently, the issue of dissent inside the church, people who spoke up and spoke out and acted out in the best sense of the term, has been the way in which the church has been at its best, even if it was in a minority, and often it was, consistently it was. And going through this, I'll give you another example. The institutionalism, the link between church and state that was so dominant in the West for so long is what continues to haunt us. And we still haven't learned that it was the worst possible witness for the church. And this is what amazes me. The folks who have used the E word to death, the evangelical word, who are supposed to be, another E word, evangelistic, that is reaching out to persons with the gospel and representing the gospel and the Beatitudes and all of that. Those folks are driving more people away from Christianity with this kind of acting out. And it really is when their churches started declining, they started asking the government to help. And here's just another mark. Oklahoma is requiring, I just read it yesterday, that's another reason I couldn't figure out to throw it in. Every public school teacher in Oklahoma has to be able to teach the Bible.
Boo.
And why? Because this is what a deacon in my church said when we were talking about it. I'll quote him. Because ain't nobody coming to Sunday school much no more anyway. And so this panic set in that the culture is against us, but we have to turn the culture so that it now incorporates our views. And so since you mentioned the T word, I wrote an article I write this twice a month column for Baptist News Global, and I wrote an article about posting the 10 Commandments. And I suggested in that article, isn't that Louisiana? Mm-hmm. And I think North Carolina's not far behind, that they were going to put it in every classroom, the 10 Commandments, but that they ought to put a caveat at the end and say, the Supreme Court has made the President of the United States immune from keeping these commandments. That's what they did.
That's what they did.
You want the kids to grow up and believe this stuff and practice this stuff. But by the way, our top man doesn't have to. That's where we are today. That's draft number 7. Because that's how far this has gotten, which is again why witness is at the heart of this, at least this phrase, to bear witness, which means you're not a bystander. However you do it, and there's not one way or another, but finding ways in the world in which we live to do that is what the times demands.
You spoke a little bit to separation of church and state already, so you've led into this question. But will you speak to the relationship and also distinction between the connection of politics and religion and the separation of church and state? Some people confuse these, and also you've already talked about how Baptists, particularly Southern Baptists and evangelicals, have completely overlooked this tradition, which is at the heart of what it means to be Baptist. But will you talk about these things?
I backpedal on the phrase separation of church and state because I think much stronger words than that are religious liberty and religious freedom. And I wrote I think it's called Baptist Ways, a History, which is a survey of Baptist history. And I think I'd have to go back and look in the index, but I think if I use the phrase separation of church and state, I probably only do it when citing references to other people, because I think that's, and here's the reason I did that. I can't speak of separation of church and state as long as folks like me get a tax write-off from the state for being like me, that is ordained. And so we all get a housing allowance, quote unquote. And when I taught at Wake, when they quit being related to the Baptists, they wouldn't let us take it when I went there to work with starting the divinity school. And so I was extremely self-righteous because all my friends were getting the tax break and I was just pure as the driven snow. I was paying taxes like God intended, I said. But now I got retired and I can take it, and I do. But there's still this connection between church and state that relates to churches and ministers, and this is true for rabbis and imams and the like, getting tax breaks. So that's why I've been hesitant. But religious liberty is what we're really talking about here, and that is people have the choice to believe or not believe, to attend church or not, to attend religious institutions of worship and practice or not. And that's not about, and that also, and here I'm an old constructionist, that means you don't have written prayers by the government in the school or elsewhere, right. or you don't have the coach bringing everybody together at the end for a prayer before or after the football game in the public school because somebody gets left out. And that's the thing. I mean, just in teaching the Bible and doing all this, the Bible is history stuff, is fake. And you don't get to know who's teaching your kid the Bible. And not only, you may be Muslim, or you may be Jewish, or you may be Hindu and Sikh, whatever. And you're being taught the two testaments. So that's where this is. That's the heart of what that difference is. It's religious liberty. It's not simply freedom to, it's freedom from, if you choose that.
Go ahead.
Good morning, Sandra Clory. Oh, you know me. But anyway, on the separation of church and state, please define the word diarchy.
Diarchy? Diarchy.
Diarchy.
Not hierarchy, but diarchy. Oh, sure. Diarchy means both of them come together to control. So it's parallel to hierarchy, but certain people. Yes. And that reminds me to say that I started to quote this, reference this. There are people who are saying out loud and in print that only Christians should be elected to office. I think that's a piece of Trump's referencing.
Yes.
That by the way, you all, only Christians in this Christian nation should be running things. So you see how one step leads to another and another, and before you know it, you've got this diarchy. Exactly.
But Bill, we might get our first Christian elected leader then. In the history of America.
Yes. No, I got to put Jimmy Carter in there.
Okay, we'll take Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
I'll take Jimmy. At least when he got out of office, for sure.
That's right.
One of the best former presidents. One of the things people were... Go ahead. Yeah.
No, but your point's extremely well taken, and that is, once you enter the political arena, you start getting into the question of immunity, don't you, for the things that you do.
Right, right.
And that becomes kind of implicit, really,
right,
because of the things you have to do that leave the gospel behind, or you feel you have to do, or that you do.
Yes, and I had a professor that said a Christian could only get elected one time in America, because to do so twice would mean you have to lie.
Yeah.
And just, you can't do that as a Christian. But I don't know. That's interesting.
That's
Speaking of sort of a diarchy and the world that is being made for us that we're trying to resist in some ways, a question from our audience was, how do we combat Project 2025, and how do we motivate more people to be concerned about it enough to read it at length?
I'll get real personal here, and I'm going home and this afternoon write a column about Project 2025, which is terrifying generally. I've read much of it, not all of it. But the column is going to be very personal. Many of you know, and she's been here with me before, that our daughter, Stephanie, who is 49, is a person with special needs. And she, in North Carolina, she now receives Medicare. A portion of my Social Security goes to do that. And Medicaid, which means, and I'll tell you all this quick story that I think I'm going to find a way to write it up. 6 months ago or so, our 1947 garage door quit on me with both cars in the garage, and it wouldn't budge. So I called this place to come and fix it, and a young woman answered. And I told her what the problem was, and she said, "How soon should I send someone to repair?" And I said, our daughter is a person with special needs, so as soon as possible. And immediately she said, my daughter is a person with special needs, and I was up all night because we changed her medication. And then she said, without taking a breath, and you know, she's young, but I worry all the time about what's going to happen to her when I'm not here anymore. And I said, what you've just said is we can all finish each other's sentences about that. And then she came over in the afternoon to bring samples of the door, and she brought them and showed them to Candace, my spouse, and me. And then I went in the other room, and she stayed an hour and a half talking with Candace because she found somebody who knew what she was going through. And I went back, and there's some analyses of all this. And Medicaid is going to have drastic reductions if this thing goes viral, which means families like ours will be lost. As a matter of fact, there's a new study out that Steve Ratner had just this week, in which North Carolina, if this goes through, North Carolina is scheduled to lose 40 to 50% of the people on Medicaid. And that's us. That's not going to they're not going to make a space for the people that, and it's hard to get on there now, and there aren't enough people on it.
Right.
There are like 60,000 people in the country on the list waiting for a particular kind of Medicaid that allows for independent living with folks. And we were in on some of that as a family. But that's one small illustration of families that will be drastically affected nationally and particularly affected in this country. And for me, that's one case study to say, if this was the only thing they were proposing, it would still be terrible.
Right.
But it's not the only thing. And that's why the thing that may save us is people are beginning to look at this and see what's happening, and you can see the distancing that's taking place. Oh, these are crazy people, and they always do this. No, 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 no. It's waiting in the wings. And that one illustration is, for me, the poignant. You cannot imagine the people with families that have special needs persons that are not helped by Medicaid in so many ways. And to lose that, it's just devastating. So that's my personal response about, but the whole document's full of stuff.
Yes. Thousands of examples of that very situation that folks will have to digest personally.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that story. It's very powerful.
Underneath Project 2025 is Christian nationalism.
Yes.
Undergirding it is the idea that Christians should have the primary role in the country.
One of the things that a friend of mine always says about this moment that we're in is a lot of these things have been existed in America before,
Yes.
But now they're saying the nasty part out loud over and over again, as if it doesn't matter anymore, and that Americans will go along with it because that's kind of the conscience of America at this time. For instance, at the Republican National Convention, deport all immigrants, like just not just as an idea behind. They had signs. Right, that everybody's holding up. We're literally going to deport everyone, and Trump is going to put in place a mass deportation that he has said is going to be the largest in American history. That's one example. Others are saying things like, we don't need democracy, that what we're trying to create, they've been very clear. Yeah. Democracy is opposed to Project 2025 and the Republican agenda and platform, so we don't need democracy anymore. These are things that people used to have in their heads, but now they're saying out loud, and it just feels, I think that's heightening the level of anxiety, but not, also there has been a lot of violence over the course of the last 8 years, not just what we saw happen to Trump, but Charlottesville, Charleston, and we could go on and on and on, mass shootings. This question, I think, is one that we've been struggling with all summer, and in every talkback. And I'm going to read it, but I want to ask folks to pay attention to where the question marks come, because it is astutely written in such a way as to draw our attention to the question marks. Work for us to do? Question mark. How do we respond to coming violence? Urgently? Question mark. In kind? Question mark. That's the whole question.
My first response is, in some ways, to respond to those questions, we don't know how to respond to those questions because we don't know what lies ahead. Right. I think the November election will be a major step in knowing what's going to be asked of us. And so it's hard to be too specific, but we must not. What worries me is we reach a point where January 6th is normative, and where violence bubbles up in ways that we're all impacted by, and people take up guns against each other. I don't mean anybody in this room at all, but where violence surrounding these political actions and becomes even more normative. And we already know the number of people who receive continuous threats for just being on a jury or speaking their mind or telling it out or writing about it. And the people who talk about that, it's terrifying to hear what they go through. So that's already underway. I think what we have to do is try to, at this point in time, is try to find ways in terms of family, in terms of community, in terms of these larger issues, in terms of school boards, not simply to attack what the people are doing, but to offer a different kind of vision that's more humanitarian, and in our case, as close to the gospel as it can be. And you've heard these stories. I had a call actually about this one time from a pastor here in the state who said, I preached on the Beatitudes, and some of my deacons told me that I was attacking Trump from the pulpit.
Well, they were right.
And yes, they were right. And they got they set up a new web page opposing that pastor, and that pastor is gone now because of those tensions. And this was probably 5 or 6 years ago. This was just as it started coming on the scene. So we're all very vulnerable. And just as I was talking about the Medicaid thing, we don't know what vulnerabilities may fall on us because of where this is taking the country. And so it's a time of great uncertainty, and that's why we need times like this and congregations like this and the dialogue like this, not because we're all going to agree on the same responses, but because we have to talk about it and help each other know how to make it known when we have the occasion to do so. And we all have to vote, of course.
Of course.
And particularly now. And there may be, what we don't know is what the changes in the Democratic Party may mean to this in 100 days. But we know that we were headed in a direction where this was this kind of Project 2025, et cetera, was becoming, it was on track.
Yeah, inevitable.
And yes, and now we have a little chance here. And providentially, they may have gotten a vice presidential candidate that's going to help us do this. Because, if you insult all the women all the time, they're coming. They may take it for a little while, but they ain't.
Eventually, that's going to be a big problem.
They're gonna, there's a word, but yeah, that's right. So that's part of the hope of where we are and what this is about. But to be able, and that's why I'm really deadly serious about, and I've gone back to Williams consistently, Roger Williams, who says clearly, there are no Christian nations, only Christian people, bound to Christ not by citizenship, but by faith. Amen. And so I go back, he wrote this toward the end of his life, a shelter for persons distressed of conscience. And at the heart of religious liberty was the recognition of the power of conscience and the need for persons to be free enough to follow their conscience and not be religionized in ways that took them away from conscience. So that's amazing.
And I love those words from Williams, and I've been thinking about them a lot. And I've been thinking about them particularly on this day because we are having a deacon retreat today. I mentioned this last week, and our deacons are going to be gathering together. What word would you give, based on your sermon today and the moment we're in, to our deacons as they consider the future direction of Myers Park Baptist Church?
I think all churches are going to have to be, many are very creative, but this distancing from religious institutions is another kind of threat to churches. And you see it in almost every congregation. And even some of the so-called mega churches are experiencing it because they have big front doors and big back doors. And so people move through, and it's not always the same people. So, and people are no longer going to come to church when they get married and have children. That's number one. And so the church has to find ways to go to them, to be with them. A couple of years ago, I marched with you all in the Pride Parade. That was for me to join Ben in carrying the church sign. Was such a powerful experience because that was a witness. And it was a witness in many ways off the charts for so many churches that can't do it because of the divisions that it would cause. But to be able to say, where are folks and how can we offer responses to people that may let them see the church in a different vein. And here's my continuing just small illustration, nothing more than that. When we were in Louisville at the Crescent Hill Baptist Church, where Steve Shoemaker was our pastor, they started what they called the Divorce Recovery Workshop, which scandalized a lot of churches in town that you talk about divorce in church. And they had a series of like 4 nights a week, and they had counselors and lawyers and family specialists who would come, and people would do that. That's I'm not giving that as normative. I'm saying finding ways to, and you all are doing that. I read about it. To provide services for people in this time, like since we've been talking about, like how does one move toward getting their special needs kids on Medicaid? What kind of authorities can we bring to the table and advertise in the community and invite people to do? And then people get a taste of what it's like to be drawn into a community, and they may not, you may get 5 out of 20 or something. But that's the witness that says the church is still reaching out even when you don't come to us. And and we have to keep the doors open, and we have to make a run, or to offer something about the responding to children and the like, or IVF, trying to give comfort to people who feel now put upon and guilty because they're trying to have children in ways that are the only ones available to them. Just sitting back and thinking about, let's pick a project and we'll try it, and if it doesn't work, we'll pick another. Yeah. And the other is, I think this is me as an old Baptist timer, I think one of the big losses with young people is, again, nobody goes to Sunday school the way they used to. So you can't expect that anybody knows anything about what's in the Bible. You can't suppose that. Because people have not consistently gone in ways that my generation, little guilt went a long ways, and I went to Sunday school every Sunday. And I had mentors in those contexts, and that's lost. And that's what we're seeing, not just in the white church, but now in the black church. We're probably 2 generations from it in the white church, and at least 1.5 in the black church, where mothers and grandmothers either don't bring or their kids don't want to go to churches. And finding a way to do that and provide responses, just thinking out loud about that in a community would be those kind of examples.
Wonderful. Last thing, Bill, is you called us to a tenderness in the benediction. Give us your final words for us around that topic today.
I think I grew up with people telling me, saying things like, "What's on your heart? Where's your heart?" And I preached at my church last Sunday, and I was telling them about the children's sermon I had one time at a church, and I made the big mistake of asking a question which you should never ask in a children's sermon. And I said, "Where do you know about Jesus?" And this little boy said, "I do, and Jesus lives in my heart." And everybody kind of sighed. And then he said, "And sometimes he lives in my tummy, and I hear him moving around." And that was when I said, "Let us pray, boys and girls." But the issue of the heart, that kid had heard that phrase, and he made it biologically possible with him. And that was a great moment for me. That's part of the tenderness. We're all arguing so much, and there's so many things dividing us, that finding ways to be together in tenderness of heart is a great thing to try from time to time, which is why I think the early church knew that when they had the breaking of bread together. They ate together and bore one another's burdens to fulfill the love and law of Christ. What's on our hearts is a good thing to keep talking about.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bill. Let's give Bill another round of applause. We'll see you next week. Come back next week to hear Bill.